The most dangerous people are not the ones who hate you in the beginning. They're the ones who make you feel deeply chosen before slowly taking your sense of self away. And by the time you realize what's happening, you're already emotionally attached to the version of them that never truly existed. Love bombing feels incredible in the beginning because it's designed to bypass emotional caution. The attention feels intense. The connection feels rare. You feel seen, understood, admired, and emotionally prioritized in ways you may have never experienced before. They text constantly. They praise you constantly. They make the relationship feel unusually deep, unusually fast. And most people mistake intensity for sincerity because emotionally, the brain wants to believe powerful feelings must mean something real. But psychologically, love bombing often follows a hidden pattern. It creates emotional dependency before genuine trust has had time to develop. That's why many victims later say the relationship felt like a dream in the beginning and confusion afterward. The emotional pace was never natural. It was accelerated. A narcissistic personality often studies emotional needs very quickly. They notice loneliness, insecurity, empathy, emotional hunger, or the desire to finally feel important to someone. Then they mirror those desires back perfectly, not because they deeply understand you, but because they understand emotional leverage. And this is why intelligent, emotionally caring people often become trapped the fastest, because good-hearted people assume emotional intensity comes from honesty. They cannot imagine someone manufacturing emotional closeness strategically. But narcissistic love bombing is rarely about connection. It's about emotional positioning. The goal is to become emotionally central in your life before you fully evaluate their behavior. Once emotional attachment forms, logic becomes weaker. You begin defending behavior you would normally question. You ignore inconsistencies because the emotional memory of the perfect beginning keeps pulling you back. Your brain becomes addicted to returning to that early emotional high. And that's the psychological trap. The beginning feels so emotionally powerful that you spend months or even years trying to get that version of them back. But many times, that version was never stable reality. It was emotional bait designed to secure attachment quickly. This is why narcissistic relationships feel psychologically exhausting. You're not just losing a person. You're grieving the illusion of who you believed they were. And illusions are difficult to let go of because emotionally, they once felt completely real. Healthy love grows slowly through consistency, emotional safety, trust, and mutual respect. Narcissistic love bombing skips those foundations entirely. It creates intensity without stability. And intensity without stability eventually becomes emotional chaos. That's why understanding this psychology matters. Because when you mistake emotional overwhelm for genuine love, you become vulnerable to manipulation that feels romantic in the beginning and emotionally destructive later. One of the darkest parts of narcissistic love bombing is that it doesn't usually begin with cruelty. It begins with emotional perfection. They become everything you were searching for: the perfect listener, the perfect partner, the perfect emotional support. They remember small details. They say exactly what you needed to hear at exactly the right moment. And because the emotional connection feels unusually strong, you naturally lower your guard. But psychologically, something deeper is happening. Narcissistic personalities often create rapid emotional intimacy because emotional speed prevents careful evaluation. When a relationship moves too fast emotionally, your brain begins bonding before your critical thinking fully activates. You stop observing patterns and start protecting feelings instead. That's why love bombing can feel addictive. Your brain starts associating this person with emotional relief, validation, excitement, and intense connection. Dopamine increases, anticipation increases. Emotional dependency quietly begins forming, and the more emotionally attached you become, the harder it becomes to recognize unhealthy behavior clearly. Then something subtle starts changing. The attention becomes inconsistent, the warmth becomes unpredictable, the affection becomes conditional. At first, you think you're imagining it. You blame stress, timing, misunderstandings, or yourself. Because your brain is still emotionally attached to the idealized version they showed you in the beginning. And this is where manipulation becomes psychologically powerful. The narcissistic cycle often depends on emotional contrast, extreme affection followed by emotional distance, warmth followed by coldness, validation followed by confusion. This inconsistency creates emotional instability inside the other person, and emotionally unstable people become easier to control because they start chasing emotional certainty again. They begin working harder to fix the connection. That's why many victims slowly lose themselves without realizing it. They become hyper-focused on restoring the original emotional high. They overthink messages, analyze behavior, seek reassurance, walk carefully around conflict. And over time, their emotional world starts revolving around the narcissist's approval. But here's the truth most people never realize. Healthy relationships do not require you to constantly earn emotional safety. Real love does not leave you emotionally anxious all the time. Real connection does not make you afraid of losing yourself. Narcissistic love bombing creates emotional dependency by making affection feel scarce after attachment forms. And scarcity increases obsession psychologically. The brain becomes trapped trying to solve emotional inconsistency. This is why leaving narcissistic relationships often feels harder than people expect. It's not simply attachment to a person, it's attachment to emotional unpredictability. The mind keeps hoping the warmth from the beginning will return permanently. But emotionally healthy people don't need to create confusion to maintain connection. They don't make you feel emotionally starved to increase your attention. They don't build intimacy through emotional instability. And once you truly understand that, you stop confusing emotional chaos with passion. One of the biggest reasons narcissistic love bombing becomes so emotionally damaging is because it slowly disconnects people from their own instincts. In the beginning, there are often small warning signs. Maybe the attention feels too intense too quickly. Maybe they become emotionally attached before truly knowing you. Maybe they talk about forever within days or weeks. Maybe the relationship already feels emotionally overwhelming instead of emotionally safe. But most people ignore these signals because the emotional validation feels powerful. And validation is psychologically dangerous when someone has spent years feeling unseen, rejected, lonely, or emotionally unimportant. Narcissistic personalities understand this deeply. They know that emotionally deprived people are easier to impress because attention itself feels healing. That's why love bombing often targets emotional vulnerabilities rather than emotional strength. The narcissist becomes whatever the other person emotionally craves most: understanding, admiration, protection, attention, affection, emotional intensity. At first, it can feel like destiny, like finally meeting someone who gets you. But over time, the relationship slowly becomes emotionally one-sided. Your boundaries start disappearing. Your emotional energy becomes consumed by keeping the relationship stable. You begin prioritizing their moods over your peace. And this is where many people unknowingly lose their identity. Because narcissistic manipulation often trains people to abandon themselves slowly instead of suddenly. You stop expressing certain opinions to avoid conflict. You become careful with your words. You over-explain yourself constantly. You tolerate behavior that once felt unacceptable because emotionally, you're trying to preserve connection. And the most painful part is this. Many victims still deeply love the narcissist while emotionally suffering because the brain keeps remembering who the person seemed to be in the beginning. That early version becomes emotionally addictive. You tell yourself they can change. You hope the warmth will return. You believe if you love harder, communicate better, or become more patient, things will go back to how they once felt. But healthy love should not require you to slowly disappear to keep it alive. Real love allows you to feel emotionally safe while remaining fully yourself. And this is why self-worth becomes so important in recognizing manipulation. People with strong emotional boundaries pay attention to consistency more than intensity. They understand that genuine connection develops through stable behavior over time, not emotional overwhelm at the beginning. Narcissistic love bombing depends on emotional imbalance. The more insecure, confused, emotionally dependent, and approval-seeking someone becomes, the easier they are to control psychologically. That's why healing begins the moment you stop asking, "Why weren't they the person they pretended to be?" and start asking, "Why did I ignore my own emotional discomfort just to keep someone from leaving?" Because that question changes everything. The hardest truth about narcissistic love bombing is realizing the relationship was never built on emotional honesty in the first place. It was built on emotional control. Not always loud control, not obvious control, but subtle psychological influence designed to keep you emotionally attached while slowly weakening your confidence, boundaries, and sense of self. And the longer it continues, the more disconnected people become from their own emotional reality. They stop trusting their instincts. They stop trusting their feelings. They start depending on the narcissist to define what's real, what matters, and what deserves emotional attention. This is why narcissistic relationships often leave people emotionally exhausted long after they end. Because manipulation doesn't only affect emotions, it affects identity. You begin forgetting who you were before constantly managing someone else's emotional behavior. But healing begins when you understand something important. The love bombing was not proof that you were deeply loved. It was proof that someone understood how to emotionally capture your attention quickly. Real love does not need to overwhelm you to keep you attached. Real love is consistent, calm, respectful, emotionally safe. And perhaps the biggest psychological shift happens when you stop romanticizing emotional chaos. Many people unconsciously associate anxiety with passion because toxic relationships condition the brain to crave emotional highs and lows. But peace is not boredom. Stability is not weakness. Emotional safety is not lack of attraction. In fact, emotionally healthy relationships often feel unfamiliar at first because there is no manipulation keeping the nervous system in constant tension. That's why boundaries become powerful. Boundaries protect your emotional clarity. They force people to reveal consistency over time instead of allowing intensity to create false trust quickly. Narcissistic personalities often dislike strong boundaries because boundaries reduce emotional control. A person who values themselves emotionally becomes much harder to manipulate, and this is the lesson many people learn too late. Attention is not always love. Intensity is not always connection, and emotional obsession is not always attraction. Sometimes it's unresolved emotional dependency created through manipulation and inconsistency. The moment you truly understand this, your standards begin changing. You stop chasing people who create confusion. You stop begging for emotional stability from emotionally unstable individuals. You stop sacrificing self-respect just to keep temporary affection alive. And slowly, you begin rebuilding something narcissistic relationships often destroy first: your relationship with yourself. So now I want to ask you something personal. Have you ever mistaken emotional intensity for genuine love and ignored your own instincts because you didn't want to lose the connection? Let me know your answer in the comments. And if this video helped you understand the hidden psychology behind narcissistic love bombing, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who truly needs to hear this. Because every upcoming video will reveal more hidden truths about narcissism, manipulation, emotional psychology, self-worth, and relationships that most people never understand. Subscribe now so you never miss the next video.